In the golden glow of studio lights at The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the audience expected laughter. They always did. It was the mid-1970s, and television still carried a certain magic, an intimacy that made living rooms feel like front-row seats. On this particular night, the set hummed with anticipation. The band had just finished its opening number. The curtains shimmered. The crowd applauded with the easy rhythm of habit. And then he walked out. Dean Martin moved with that familiar, unhurried grace, tie slightly loosened, smile half-cocked, eyes twinkling as if he knew something the rest of the room didn't. The applause swelled. It always did when he appeared. Dean wasn't just a guest. He was comfort. He was mischief. He was the kind of presence that made everything feel effortless. Across the stage stood Johnny Carson, master of the monologue, guardian of the late-night throne. Johnny's smile was polished, his timing impeccable. But when Dean Martin was around, something shifted. The roles blurred. Carson, the unshakable host, became the delighted spectator. They shook hands. "Well, look who finally showed up," Carson quipped. Dean shrugged. "I was waiting to see if anyone else wanted to host tonight." The crowd erupted. It was classic Dean, cool, deflecting, never appearing to try too hard. But beneath the laughter, something quieter lingered. Those who watched closely might have noticed it. The way Dean's eyes scanned the studio for just a fraction longer than usual. The way his smile faded between punchlines. Carson noticed. He always noticed. The atmosphere before the moment. The interview began as expected, light teasing, stories from the road, playful jabs about old Hollywood dinners and forgotten lyrics. They referenced mutual friends. They joked about aging. They sparred like two seasoned musicians riffing on familiar chords. But Carson sensed something different in Dean's cadence, a pause that didn't belong, a note slightly off-key. Johnny leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said casually, "people forget you actually know how to play piano." The audience murmured. Dean raised an eyebrow. "I know how to sit at one," he replied. Carson grinned. "That's not what I've heard." Dean waved it off. "Don't believe everything you hear." And then, without fully planning it, Carson did something bold. "There's a piano right over there," he said, pointing toward the polished instrument near the bandstand. "Why don't you prove it?" The room reacted instantly. Gasps, applause, anticipation crackled like static in the air. Dean looked at the piano. For a brief second, the mask slipped. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to see. But Johnny saw it. A flicker of hesitation. The weight behind a simple dare. To the audience, it was just a playful challenge. To Dean, it was something else. Music had always been his sanctuary. Long before sold-out shows and champagne toasts, before Vegas lights and standing ovations, there had been a small room, a worn piano, and a boy practicing scales long after the house had gone quiet. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was memory. It was family dinners. It was hard years. It was the quiet nights when applause didn't exist. And Dean Martin, master of effortless cool, had built a career on never revealing too much. Carson leaned forward. "Come on, Dean, I dare you." The word hung in the air. Dare. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't aggressive. It was playful. But it carried weight. Dean stood slowly. The applause rose again, louder now, encouraging. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed his tie, and walked toward the piano. Each step felt longer than it should have. The band fell silent. Even the studio crew seemed to hold their breath. Dean sat down on the piano bench. He didn't look at Carson. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at the keys. And for a moment, the years folded back. Silence before sound. He placed his hands gently on the ivory. Not dramatically. Not for effect. Just gently. The studio lights reflected softly against the polished surface. A hush settled so completely that the faint hum of the air conditioning could almost be heard. Carson leaned forward in his chair, elbows on knees. Dean played a single note. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it was sure. Then another. And another. A melody began to form, simple at first, almost tentative. The kind of tune you hum absent-mindedly when you're alone. But as the notes connected, something changed. Dean's posture shifted, his shoulders relaxed. The playful persona faded, replaced by something raw and unguarded. The melody deepened. It wasn't a show tune. It wasn't one of his signature hits. It was quieter, more personal. The audience, expecting a comedic flourish or exaggerated flourish, instead found themselves listening to something intimate. Carson's expression changed. The smirk softened. The studio no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a living room, a memory in every note. Dean closed his eyes, and the melody grew. There were traces of longing in it, gentle dips into minor keys, subtle hesitations before resolution. It felt less like a performance and more like remembering. Carson had seen Dean perform countless times. But this was different. This wasn't Dean Martin the entertainer. This was Dino Crosti, the son of Italian immigrants, the boy who learned music before he learned polish, the man who understood that sometimes the quietest moments carry the heaviest truths. A few notes stumbled, not because of lack of skill, but because emotion isn't always clean. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't clap. They listened. Dean transitioned seamlessly into a familiar chord progression, one that hinted at a classic standard, a melody that brushed against nostalgia without fully naming it. Carson's eyes glistened. He tried to blink it away. It didn't work. The shift no one expected. What began as a dare had turned into something sacred. The camera slowly panned across the audience. Faces that had entered the studio ready for late-night jokes now reflected something else entirely: connection. Dean's voice joined the piano softly. Not full volume. Not theatrical. Just enough. It wasn't a performance aimed at applause. It was a conversation whispered in music. Carson lowered his gaze briefly, pressing his lips together. When he looked back up, his composure had cracked. Not dramatically, but honestly, and that honesty spread. The applause, when it finally came, wasn't explosive. It was warm, deep, sustained. Dean let the final note linger before lifting his hands from the keys. Silence followed. He didn't bow. He didn't wink. He simply stood and walked back toward his chair. Carson remained still for a moment longer. Then he stood. The two men met halfway across the stage. No joke. No punchline. Just a handshake that turned into a brief, unspoken embrace. The tear that changed everything. When Carson finally spoke, his voice carried something new. Well, he said quietly, I guess I won't be daring you again. The audience laughed softly through their emotion. Dean smiled, but it wasn't the usual grin. It was gentler. As the show went to commercial break, the camera caught something fleeting. Carson turning slightly away from the audience, lifting a hand discreetly to his eye. Later, crew members would say they'd never seen Johnny like that. Not shaken. Not broken. Just moved. Deeply. Because sometimes, behind every polished persona, there's a story waiting for permission to be heard. And sometimes all it takes is a dare. The applause faded. The red on air sign dimmed. And the illusion of television perfection dissolved into the quiet machinery of reality. Behind the curtain of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, stagehands moved quickly, adjusting cables, resetting props, speaking in low professional tones. The band resumed a light instrumental during the commercial break. Assistants checked cue cards. Makeup artists hovered nearby, ready to restore the polished glow demanded by television. But something had shifted. Everyone felt it. The air backstage wasn't frantic, it was hushed. Because when Dean Martin walked off that stage, he didn't walk like a man who had just entertained millions. He walked like a man who had just opened a door he usually kept locked. The corridor of silence. Dean stepped into the narrow backstage hallway, the applause still echoing faintly from the studio. His polished shoes tapped against the concrete floor. The laughter and music from the band felt distant now, like sound drifting from another world. He loosened his tie slightly. Not for comfort. For air. A production assistant started to approach him, perhaps to offer praise or directions, but something in Dean's expression stopped her. She simply nodded and stepped aside. He wasn't upset. He wasn't angry. But he was somewhere else. Moments later, Johnny Carson emerged from the stage entrance. Johnny didn't head toward his dressing room. He followed Dean. He didn't call out. He just followed. The dressing room door. Dean's dressing room door clicked shut with a soft finality. Inside, the room was simple. Mirror framed with bulbs, a small couch, a coat rack, a glass of water resting untouched on the counter. Dean stood before the mirror. For years, that mirror had reflected confidence, timing, control. Tonight, it reflected something quieter. He removed his jacket and placed it carefully over the back of a chair. His eyes lingered on his own reflection as if searching for something. A knock came. Soft. Measured. Dean didn't answer right away. Another knock. It's just me, Johnny said from outside. There was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. Then, doors open. Carson stepped in and closed it gently behind him. For a moment, neither man spoke. No audience. No applause. No cue cards. Just two men in a quiet room. The question beneath the joke. Johnny leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely. You never told me you could play like that. Dean shrugged, sitting down slowly on the couch. You never asked. That would have been the perfect setup for a joke. But neither of them laughed. Johnny stepped closer. That wasn't just playing Dean. Silence. Dean looked down at his hands. These, he said quietly, they remember things. Johnny studied him carefully. In years of hosting, he had learned to read faces the way others read scripts. He knew when guests were exaggerating, when they were deflecting, when they were protecting themselves. Tonight wasn't deflection. It was exposure. Where'd you learn that? Johnny asked softly. Dean exhaled slowly. From someone who didn't have much else to give. The words hung heavy in the room. A memory unspoken. Dean leaned back, staring at the ceiling lights. My father worked long hours, he began. Didn't talk much, didn't smile much either. But when he came home at night, sometimes he'd sit at this old upright piano we had, keys chipped, half of them out of tune. Johnny didn't interrupt. He wasn't a performer, Dean continued. Didn't know fancy chords, but he played like he meant it, played like it was the only place he didn't have to fight. Dean swallowed. I used to sit on the stairs and listen, thought he didn't know I was there. Johnny understood now. That melody tonight. Dean nodded slowly. He used to play something like it, not exact, just the feeling of it. There it was. Not nostalgia for fame. Not regret. Just memory. The vulnerability no one saw. You almost didn't go over to that piano, Johnny said. Dean gave a faint smile. Yeah. Why? Dean hesitated. Because when you're the guy who's always relaxed, always joking, people expect that version of you. He looked up. They don't expect the quiet one. Johnny sat down opposite him. Maybe they need to see him. Dean shook his head gently. No, they need to see hope. They need to see that nothing gets to you. And does nothing get to you? Johnny asked. The question was direct. Honest. And dangerous. Dean didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked to the mirror again. He looked at himself for a long time before speaking. Everything gets to you, Johnny. The words were calm. Not bitter. Just true. A shift between friends. Outside, the studio manager signaled 2 minutes until they were back on air. But inside that dressing room, time felt suspended. Johnny stood. You know, he said quietly, I've interviewed presidents, actors, musicians. I've seen rehearsed vulnerability. He paused. That wasn't rehearsed. Dean gave him a sideways glance. You dared me. Johnny smiled faintly. Yeah, I did. Another silence. But this one felt lighter, more understood. Johnny stepped toward the door, then stopped. "You ever think about doing more of that?" he asked. Dean raised an eyebrow. "Playing piano? Letting people see you?" Dean chuckled softly. "Careful, Johnny. You keep talking like that, I'll have to start charging you for therapy." Finally, they both laughed. But the laughter didn't erase what had just happened. It layered over it. The return to the stage. A stage assistant knocked quickly. 30 seconds. Dean slipped his jacket back on. The polished persona returned almost effortlessly, shoulders squared, smile adjusted. The charm clicked back into place like a well-worn jacket. But something subtle remained. Johnny noticed it. As they walked back toward the stage entrance, the band's music swelled again. The red light blinked on. The audience cheered as they re-entered. And just like that, they were once again host and guest. Professional, witty, effortless. But now, beneath the jokes, there was a shared understanding. The moment that almost didn't happen. Later that night, after the show wrapped and the studio emptied, a janitor quietly wiped fingerprints from the piano keys. He didn't know the significance of what had happened. He didn't know that millions of viewers had just seen something real. He didn't know that a playful dare had opened a window into a man rarely seen without armor. But somewhere across the country, in quiet living rooms, people felt it. A father turned to his son and said, "See, even the strongest men feel things." A young musician sat at her own piano and tried to play that melody by memory. A man who hadn't spoken to his father in years picked up the phone. Moments like that don't trend. They don't make headlines. They don't shout. They whisper. The suspense that lingered. What no one knew, not even Johnny, was that Dean had been carrying something heavier than nostalgia that night. Something that made that piano moment more than memory. More than sentiment. Something that had almost made him refuse the dare entirely. And it wasn't fear of performing. It was fear of remembering. Because sometimes, when you open the door to music, you don't just hear the melody. You hear everything attached to it. And that night, the past had been louder than applause, 3 nights after the piano. 3 nights of replay. 3 nights of silence between applause. The clip from The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson had already begun circulating across the country. Not viral the way modern moments spread, but whispered about, replayed on late-night rebroadcasts, discussed in newspaper columns. Dean Martin shows rare vulnerability. Carson visibly moved. But headlines only ever tell half the truth. The real story didn't happen on stage. It happened in the quiet of 2:17 a.m. The ring in the dark. Johnny Carson was awake when the phone rang. He often was. Hosting a nightly show trained your mind to stay alert long after the audience had gone to bed. Monologues replayed in his thoughts. Punchlines refined themselves in the dark. The phone rang again. He stared at it for a moment. Almost no one called him that late unless something was wrong. He picked up. "Hello." Silence. Not empty silence. Breathing. Measured, controlled. Then, "It's me." Carson sat up instantly. Dean Martin. Dean was not a 2 a.m. caller. He was a show-up late, leave early kind of man. A laugh-and-exit presence, not a midnight confessor. "You okay?" Johnny asked carefully. A pause. "You ever wish you hadn't asked something?" Dean replied. Johnny's chest tightened slightly. "What's this about?" "The piano. The weight behind the melody. There are moments in life that feel small in real time and enormous later." Johnny had dared Dean to play for ratings. No. For curiosity, maybe. For fun, definitely. But he hadn't realized he'd pulled a thread connected to something deeper. "Dean," Johnny began, "if this is about the show." "It's not about the show." Dean's voice wasn't slurred. It wasn't joking. It was steady. "That melody, I haven't played it in 20 years. Johnny stayed quiet. My father used to play it, Dean continued. Last thing I ever heard him play before he got sick. A long silence. And when you pointed to that piano, Dean said slowly, I thought I could just play something safe, something polished. Johnny understood now. But I didn't, Dean added. My hands didn't let me. The memory that refused to stay quiet. Dean rarely spoke about childhood. The public knew the polished story, immigrant roots, boxing, singing, rise to stardom. But they didn't know the small kitchen with cracked linoleum floors. They didn't know the nights when money was thin and pride was thinner. They didn't know the sound of an exhausted man playing a slightly out-of-tune piano, as if it were the only beautiful thing in the house. When I was a kid, Dean said over the phone, I thought music was weakness. My father worked with his hands, bled for a living, but when he played, he looked softer. Johnny listened, unmoving. I didn't understand it then, Dean continued. I do now. The fear beneath the cool. You built an image, Johnny said carefully. Relaxed, untouchable. That wasn't an accident, Dean replied. There it was. The admission. People don't lean on the guy who looks fragile, Dean said. They lean on the strong one. And you're tired? Johnny asked quietly. Another pause. I'm human. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tragic. It was honest. And honesty carries its own weight. The confession no one expected. I almost walked off, Dean admitted. When you said, I dare you. Johnny's pulse slowed. I stood there thinking, if I sit at that piano, something's going to come out that I can't control. And it did, Johnny said softly. Yeah. The word wasn't regretful. It wasn't triumphant. It was reflective. You know what scared me? Dean added. What? That it felt good. Johnny closed his eyes briefly. Letting people see you and surviving it can be more frightening than hiding. A truth about fathers. You ever make peace with your father? Johnny asked. Dean didn't answer right away. No, he said finally, not before he passed. The room on Johnny's end felt smaller. I spent years trying to be tougher than him, Dean continued. More controlled, more polished. And were you? Johnny asked. Dean's voice shifted. I don't know. There was something almost childlike in that confession. Fame doesn't erase unfinished conversations. It only buries them under applause. The line that changed everything. Johnny, Dean said quietly, when I finished playing and I looked up, you were crying. Johnny exhaled slowly. I wasn't crying. Dean gave a faint, audible smile. You weren't. A beat. Why? Johnny hesitated. Because truth demands courage on both ends. Because I saw my father too, Johnny said finally. Silence flooded the line. 2 men. 2 fathers. 2 unfinished conversations carried in music. The shared realization. Funny thing, Dean murmured. We spend our whole careers pretending to be invincible. And one song ruins it, Johnny replied. Or fixes it. That sentence lingered. Not ruins. Fixes. Because sometimes vulnerability doesn't break an image. It deepens it. The suspense beneath the calm. You know they're replaying the clip, Johnny said carefully. I figured. People are talking. About what? Dean asked. That you looked different. Dean let out a slow breath. That's what I'm afraid of. Johnny frowned. Afraid of what? That if they see that side too often, they won't believe the other one anymore. The cool. The effortless charm. The untouchable presence. Johnny's voice grew firm. Or maybe they'll believe all of you. Another silence. Longer this time. Heavier. The decision forming in the dark. I've got another appearance next month, Dean said slowly. Yeah. I'm thinking about bringing the piano into it. Johnny sat upright. That's not a small move. I know. You sure? Dean's voice held something new. Resolve. If I'm going to carry those memories, I might as well stop pretending they don't exist. That wasn't weakness. That was strength recalibrated. The call that ended softly. The conversation drifted after that. Lighter topics, small jokes, the familiar rhythm returning. But something fundamental had shifted. When they finally hung up, Johnny remained seated in the dark. He looked at the phone for a long time. Not because he was worried, but because he realized something rare had just happened. Two men known for composure had dropped it. And nothing collapsed. The unseen consequence. The following week, ratings for that episode quietly spiked. Viewers wrote letters. Not about jokes. About the piano. About fathers. About memory. One letter simply said, "Thank you for reminding my husband that strong men can cry." Johnny kept that one. He didn't show it to Dean. Not yet. Because something told him. The real change hadn't finished unfolding. And when Dean returned next month, the world wouldn't just see a guest. They'd see a man choosing which version of himself to keep. A month passed. In television time, that was an eternity. The clip from The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson had settled into legend. Not scandal, not controversy, something rarer. Reverence. Producers noticed it first. Letters poured in, not from critics dissecting technique, but from ordinary people describing how that single melody had stirred something they thought they'd buried. But this time, the anticipation felt different. Because this time, it wasn't a dare. It was a choice. Backstage before the curtain rose, Dean Martin stood alone in his dressing room, staring at a folded piece of paper resting on the table beside him. He hadn't told anyone about it. Not the producers. Not the band. Not even Johnny Carson. On that paper was a short handwritten note. 3 sentences. He'd rewritten it 4 times. His reflection in the mirror looked familiar, calm, polished, charming. But behind the eyes was something steadier now. Not hesitation. Decision. A knock at the door. 5 minutes, Mr. Martin. Dean nodded. He slipped the paper into his inside jacket pocket. Tonight wasn't about proving he could play piano. Tonight was about deciding who he would be when the music stopped. The return. The audience welcomed him with thunder. Applause rolled through the studio like a wave. It was louder than usual, anticipatory, curious. Dean stepped out with his signature ease, adjusting his cuffs, flashing that half-smile that had made millions feel at home. Carson greeted him warmly, but this time Johnny's eyes searched Dean's face with something new, respect mixed with uncertainty. Would he play again? Would he retreat back into charm and distance? Or would he go further? They sat. The banter began. Familiar, comfortable, safe. Stories about travel, Vegas anecdotes, playful jabs about late nights and forgotten lyrics. The audience laughed, but beneath the laughter, there was an undercurrent of waiting. And Dean felt it. The question no one expected. Halfway through the segment, Carson leaned slightly forward. "You know," Johnny said casually, "after last time, we had a lot of people ask if you'd ever sit at that piano again." The audience reacted instantly. Applause, encouragement, hopeful murmurs. Dean didn't answer right away. He let the noise settle. Then he stood. But he didn't walk toward the piano. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket. The studio quieted. He unfolded the paper. Carson blinked. This wasn't planned. The letter. Dean looked out at the audience. Not over them. At them. "I got a letter last week," he began. His voice wasn't theatrical. It was grounded. It said, "I haven't spoken to my father in 12 years. After hearing that song, I called him." The room stilled. Dean continued. "He didn't write to thank me for the music." A pause. "He wrote to say thank you for being human." You could feel it. The shift. No jokes. No shield. Carson didn't move. The band didn't breathe. Dean folded the paper carefully. "You see, I've spent a long time trying to be the guy who never lets anything show," he said softly, "because that's what people expect." He glanced at Carson. "And that's what I thought strength was." Silence expanded like a held breath. "But strength isn't pretending you don't feel something." His voice steadied. "It's letting people see that you do." The walk to the piano. This time he didn't wait for applause. He walked to the piano without being asked. The audience began clapping instinctively, but it wasn't loud, it was reverent. Dean sat down slowly. He looked at the keys. Then he looked up at Carson. "This one's not for television," he said quietly. "It's for the people who never got to say what they needed to." You could hear someone in the audience inhale sharply. Dean began to play. The melody wasn't identical to the first night. It had evolved, where the previous song carried memory. This one carried release. It moved through minor chords with confidence, not hesitation. The notes didn't stumble, they resolved. And then he sang. Softly, not for perfection, not for applause, but with intention. Each word felt chosen. Each phrase carried weight. Carson's eyes shimmered again, but this time he didn't hide it. He didn't turn away. He let the camera see him. The moment of breaking and becoming. Halfway through the song, Dean paused. Just a fraction. His fingers hovered over the keys. And for a split second, it looked as though emotion might overpower him. The room tightened. But instead of retreating, he continued. Stronger, clearer. When the final note lingered, he didn't rush away. He let it hang in the air like a question finally answered. Silence followed. Not awkward, sacred. And then, the audience rose. Not just applause, a standing ovation. Sustained, unscripted, overwhelming. Dean stood slowly. For once, he didn't deflect it with humor. He absorbed it, not as validation, but as confirmation. Carson's final words. Dean returned to his chair. Johnny stood as well. For a long moment, Carson didn't speak. When he did, his voice carried something it rarely did on air. Vulnerability. You know, Johnny said, swallowing gently, people tune in for laughs. He looked at Dean. But sometimes they stay for truth. The audience softened again. Carson extended his hand. Dean took it. But this time it wasn't a brief handshake. It was firm, intentional. Two men acknowledging that something larger than ratings had just happened. After the show, backstage there were no loud congratulations. No producer high-fives. Just quiet nods. Dean returned to his dressing room. He removed his jacket and placed it on the chair. But this time he didn't look exhausted. He looked lighter. Carson entered without knocking. Well, Johnny said softly, I guess that answers the question. Dean smiled gently. Which one? Who you are? Dean sat down. For a long time, he said, I thought I had to choose between being strong and being honest. Johnny waited. I was wrong. The ripple that followed. In the weeks that followed, something subtle changed in how audiences saw him. He was still charming, still witty, still smooth. But now there was depth beneath it. An understanding that the cool exterior wasn't armor. It was balance. Letters continued arriving. Not about celebrity. Not about nostalgia. About courage. One read. I played piano for my son tonight, first time in years. Another said, I thought I had to hide my emotions to be respected. Thank you for proving otherwise. Dean read them quietly. He never publicized them. He didn't need to, because the real transformation wasn't public. It was internal. The legacy of a dare. Years later, when people spoke about that episode, they didn't talk about ratings. They didn't talk about jokes. They talked about the piano, about a dare that turned into a decision, about a moment when two men chose truth over polish, and about the realization that strength isn't silence. It's sincerity. The final scene. Late one evening, long after the cameras stopped and the applause faded into memory, Dean sat alone at a piano in his home. No audience, no lights, no expectations. He played the melody again. But this time, there was no hesitation. No fear of being seen. Just music. Just memory. Just peace. And somewhere in another quiet house, Johnny Carson sat listening to a recording of that night, smiling not because it made good television, but because it reminded him that sometimes the most powerful performances aren't planned. They're chosen.